The survey pin was exactly where it had always been. That was the problem. Not where anyone had assumed it was. Not where 30 years of informal understanding had placed it. Not where the developer's construction drawings had marked it, or where the HOA's master plan had labeled it, or where the 53 homes of Clearwater Ranch had been built in relation to it. Where it actually was. I found it on a Wednesday morning in October, after 6 weeks of searching that had begun as a routine boundary verification and had become, as the measurements accumulated and the numbers refused to produce the result I expected, something considerably more significant. I am a licensed land surveyor. I had been hired by my own wife, Renata, who is a property rights attorney, to conduct a formal survey of our ranch boundaries before we refinanced the property. The ranch had been in my family for 4 generations. The boundary had never been formally surveyed with modern GPS technology and ground truthing against the original Government Land Office records from 1887. I found the survey pin at the location the 1887 GLO records described. Then I found the second pin, and the third, and the fourth. And then I did the math. The math said that the eastern boundary of the Reeves Ranch, the boundary that every document produced in the past 30 years had described as running along the ridgeline, did not run along the ridgeline. It ran 2,340 feet east of the ridgeline, through the middle of Clearwater Ranch, HOA, through 47 residential lots, 3 common areas, the community center, the maintenance road, and the only vehicular access point connecting Clearwater Ranch's 53 homes to the county road. I sat in my truck at the survey pin location for a long time. I called Renata. She said, "How bad?" I said, "I need you to look at something before I answer that." She drove out, she looked at the pin, she looked at my measurements, she looked at the survey map I had been building as I worked. She was quiet for 4 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on my dashboard. Then she said, "This is the only access road." "Yes," I said. "And it's on our property." "The survey says yes." "The survey you just conducted." "Against the 1887 GLO records," I said, "the original government monuments, they don't lie." She looked at the map again, 53 households. 53 households with no legal access to the county road, I said, "if the survey is correct." "Is it correct?" I had been a licensed land surveyor for 26 years. I had found errors in surveys before, my own and others. Errors were possible. I looked at my work. "I need a second opinion," I said, "but yes, I believe it's correct." The second opinion arrived 10 days later in the form of Gerald Morrison, the most respected boundary surveyor in the county, who had been hired by Renata to independently verify my findings without knowing what those findings were. Gerald spent 3 days on the boundary. He used different equipment. He used different methodology. He cross-referenced different historical records. He called me when he was done. He said, "Desmond, the Reeves Ranch eastern boundary is 2,328 feet east of the ridgeline." A pause. "I got a slightly different number than whatever you got, but we're talking about 12 feet of difference across a 2-mile boundary. The substance is the same." "The access road," I said, "is on the Reeves Ranch," he said. "Yes." What followed those 2 surveys, what Renata and I did with the information, what the HOA discovered when they retained their own surveyor, what the 53 households of Clearwater Ranch experienced when they understood the full scope of what had been found, what Karen Whitmore did when the access road situation became personal, and what the 6 months of legal and human complexity that followed produced, none of that was about the survey. The survey was just the Wednesday morning I found a pin that had always been in the same place. What it was about was 30 years of assumptions that nobody had checked. And what happens when the ground tells you something different than the paperwork? My name is Desmond Reeves, 54 years old, 26 years as a licensed land surveyor in Garfield County, Colorado. I measure the earth for a living. I establish where things are, where they have always been, and what the legal record says about the relationship between the two. I understand, with the professional precision of someone who has spent a quarter-century finding the truth of boundaries, that the earth does not negotiate. A pin is where a pin is. A line is where a line is. The legal record reflects what was established, not what was assumed, and the gap between those two things, between what was assumed and what was established, is where disputes of extraordinary consequence are born. My wife, Renata, is a property rights attorney. She has spent 19 years litigating the consequences of those gaps. She has seen what happens when 30 years of assumptions about a boundary encounter the truth of a survey. She had seen it in other people's cases. She had not expected to see it in her own. The Reeves Ranch had been in my family since 1887, when my great-great-grandfather Elias Reeves had homesteaded 412 acres on the western slope under the Homestead Act. The original patent from the General Land Office described the boundaries with the precision of 1887 surveying technology. Section, township, range, and the specific measurements from government monuments that would, 136 years later, tell me exactly where my property was. The ranch had been passed through 4 generations without a formal modern survey, because 4 generations of Reeves had understood the boundaries the way families understand things that have never been questioned, through inheritance of knowledge, through walking the land, through the informal but deeply held certainty that comes from generation after generation of occupation. The ridgeline had been the eastern boundary in our family's understanding since before living memory. It was a natural feature, clearly visible, and it had served as the practical boundary in every conversation, every grazing agreement, every neighborly interaction that involved the ranch's eastern edge. The ridgeline was not, it turned out, where Elias Reeves's eastern boundary had been established. Clearwater Ranch had been developed 28 years ago by a developer named Marcus Aldridge, who had purchased land east of what he understood to be the Reeves Ranch boundary, obtained development approvals, installed infrastructure, sold 53 lots, and created a community of homes that had been occupied for nearly 3 decades by families who had bought, financed, refinanced, sold, resold, and in all other respects treated their properties as the unencumbered private real estate they believed them to be. The access road had been built by Aldridge as a private road serving the development. It connected Clearwater Ranch's internal street network to the county road. It ran along what Aldridge's construction drawings had labeled the western boundary of the development, the boundary he understood to be the eastern boundary of the Reeves Ranch. Aldridge's understanding had been based on the ridgeline. Nobody had checked. I want to be precise about what I found and what I did not find, because precision matters in situations like this, and because the temptation to characterize findings beyond what they actually establish is one that I have resisted professionally for 26 years, and was not going to abandon in the most significant survey finding of my career. What I found, the original government monuments established by the 1887 GLO survey, confirmed by Gerald Morrison's independent survey, placed the Reeves Ranch eastern boundary 2,340 feet east of the ridgeline, encompassing terrain that included the access road and significant portions of the developed Clearwater Ranch community. What I did not find, any recorded easement, license, or access right granted by the Reeves family to the Clearwater Ranch developer, the HOA, or any of the 53 property owners for use of the access road. What I did not know at the time of the survey, whether any such easement existed in an unrecorded form, whether the developer had obtained a legal opinion regarding the boundary before development, whether any prior survey had been conducted that had produced the ridgeline boundary, and whether any of a dozen other legal mechanisms might affect the analysis. Renata spent 2 weeks researching these questions before we took any external action. She found no recorded easement. She found no prior survey in the county records that had established the ridgeline as the Reeves Ranch eastern boundary. She found surveys of the Clearwater Ranch development that had simply accepted the ridgeline as the given western boundary without independently verifying it against the original government records. She found no recorded legal opinion. She found no prescriptive easement that had ripened, because prescriptive easements in Colorado require open, notorious, hostile, and continuous use for 18 years, and the use of the access road had been neither hostile nor adverse to us. It had been use that neither we nor anyone else had understood was on our property. She also found something else. The original deed for the Clearwater Ranch development, recorded 28 years ago, contained a property description that placed the western boundary of the development at the ridgeline. The deed description was legally recorded and had formed the basis of all 53 individual lot deeds, all 53 sets of title insurance policies, all 53 mortgage instruments, and all subsequent transactions for 3 decades. The deed description was inconsistent with the government monuments, which meant that 53 title insurance policies had been issued on the basis of a boundary description that did not reflect the established survey monuments. Renata called 2 title insurance specialists. Both said the same thing in different language. This was a significant problem. We hired Leonard Marsh as our outside counsel. Leonard had 30 years of property rights litigation experience and had handled 3 prior adverse possession and boundary dispute cases of comparable complexity. He reviewed everything Renata had compiled and spent a week developing his own analysis. He called us on a Friday evening. Renata and I sat at the kitchen table and put him on speaker. He said, "I want to be direct with you about several things." We said we wanted him to be direct. He said, "First, the survey findings appear to be accurate. Gerald Morrison's independent confirmation is significant. The boundary is where the monuments say it is." "Yes," I said. "Second, the legal consequences of this finding are complex, multi-party, and will take time to fully resolve. You are not going to have a simple resolution to this situation." "We understand," Renata said. "Third, you have choices about how you approach this. Those choices will affect not only the legal outcome, but the human outcome. What happens to 53 families who have lived in good faith on property that may partially overlap with yours?" We were quiet. "Fourth," Leonard said, "Karen Whitmore." Karen Whitmore was a resident of Clearwater Ranch. She had lived there for 6 years. She was 56, former municipal administrator, currently what she described as a community governance consultant. She was the current president of the Clearwater Ranch HOA. She had been, since the first week of her residency in Clearwater Ranch, engaged in a persistent campaign of complaints, objections, and HOA proceedings directed at the Reeves Ranch, specifically at our use of the ranch's access trail that ran along the ridgeline, which Karen had characterized as a nuisance activity that disturbed wildlife, created dust, and in her most recent complaint, filed 3 months before my survey, constituted an encroachment on Clearwater Ranch's western boundary. Karen had filed a complaint alleging that our trail use encroached on her community's boundary. My survey had found that her community's boundary encroached on ours. Leonard had done his research. He said Karen Whitmore's most recent HOA complaint, filed 3 months ago, alleged that Reeves Ranch activities along the ridgeline constituted a boundary encroachment. That complaint is currently pending before the Clearwater Ranch Board. "I know," I said. "The survey findings, if they hold, and I believe they will, establish that the Clearwater Ranch access road is on Reeves Ranch property. The access road is the only vehicular connection between the development and the county road. Without a legal access right to that road, the development is legally landlocked." "Yes," Renata said. "Karen Whitmore's complaint accused you of encroaching on her community's boundary while her community's access road is on your property." A pause. "I want you to understand the full weight of what that means before we discuss how to proceed. We understood the full weight. How do we proceed? I said. Leonard said, that depends on what outcome you want. You have legally a strong position. You own the land. The access road is on your land. Without an easement, the access road is yours to control. The 53 households of Clearwater Ranch could, in theory, be entirely dependent on your goodwill for access to the county road. That's not an outcome we want, Renata said. I know, Leonard said, which is why I said it depends on what outcome you want. Tell me what that is. Renata and I had talked about this for 2 weeks before the call with Leonard. We had talked about it the way you talk about something that is large and consequential, and that involves people who are not your adversaries, even though the situation positions you across from them. Renata said, we want a documented, legal, properly recorded access easement that gives Clearwater Ranch the road access they have been using. We want it to be fair, a fair easement negotiated in good faith, not an extraction. We want the boundary to be properly recorded and acknowledged, and we want Karen Whitmore's complaint against us to be withdrawn with a formal acknowledgement that it had no basis. A pause. Leonard said, the last item is important, Renata said. She filed a complaint alleging we were encroaching on her community's boundary. The survey shows her community has been on ours. I'm not asking for a public humiliation. I'm asking for a formal acknowledgement. I understand, Leonard said. I think that's achievable. Let me explain the sequence. The sequence Leonard proposed was careful and specific. We would approach the Clearwater Ranch HOA board directly before any public filing with the survey findings. We would present the findings as information the board needed in order to understand the situation, not as a legal threat. We would simultaneously propose a framework for resolution, a permanent access easement, properly drafted and recorded, granting the HOA and all current and future residents of Clearwater Ranch legal access to the road in perpetuity, in exchange for a fair easement payment and the formal correction of the boundary records. We would give the board 30 days to retain their own surveyor and their own legal counsel before any further steps. We would make clear that we were not interested in disrupting the lives of 53 households who had acted in complete good faith. We would also make clear that the boundary was the boundary, that the access road was on our property, and that a formal legal resolution was necessary. I called Howard Kimball, the board vice president, not Karen, because Karen was the board president and Leonard had advised that our initial contact should not be with the person who had filed the complaint against us on a Tuesday morning. Howard was a retired civil engineer. He had the specific quality of a man who understood systems and who, when I described what I was calling about, became very still in the way engineers become still when a system failure is being reported. I said, Howard, I need to meet with you and your legal counsel as soon as possible. I have survey findings that affect Clearwater Ranch significantly. He said, how significantly? I said, your access road may be on Reeves Ranch property. There was a silence of approximately 8 seconds. Then he said, I'll call our attorney this morning. The meeting was the following Thursday. Renata and Leonard and I sat across from Howard, the HOA's attorney, a property rights specialist named Patricia Webb, who I knew by reputation as thorough and fair, and 2 other board members. Karen was not at the meeting. Howard had not included her. I did not ask why. I had my own theory. I presented the survey findings, Gerald Morrison's confirmation, the historical analysis, the title chain research, the absence of any recorded easement. Patricia Webb asked detailed and intelligent questions. She was processing the information with the specific attention of an attorney who is assessing the exposure of her clients and who is trying to understand the full scope of the situation before she says anything that constrains her options. At the end of the presentation, she said, we'll need to retain our own surveyor. Of course, I said, take whatever time you need. She said, and you're proposing a negotiated easement rather than litigation. We want a resolution that works for your community, Renata said. 53 households bought their homes in good faith. They shouldn't bear the cost of a survey error that happened before they arrived. Patricia looked at Renata for a moment. What do you want in exchange? A fair easement payment, Renata said, proper boundary documentation, and withdrawal of the pending HOA complaint against the Reeves Ranch, with a written acknowledgement that the complaint lacked factual basis. Howard looked at the table. Patricia said, the complaint was filed by your board president alleging that the Reeves Ranch was encroaching on Clearwater Ranch's western boundary, Renata said. The survey establishes that the boundary runs 2,300 feet east of where the complaint alleged. The complaint had no factual basis. We want that acknowledged. Patricia said, I'll discuss this with my client. She did. The Clearwater Ranch HOA retained their own surveyor, a firm from Grand Junction that I respected, who spent 10 days on the boundary and produced findings consistent with mine and Gerald Morrison's within acceptable survey tolerance. The findings were not what Karen had expected. I know this because Howard called me the Monday after the HOA's survey was completed and said, carefully, that the board had held an emergency session over the weekend and that there had been significant internal discussion about how to proceed. I asked how Karen had responded to the survey findings. Howard was quiet for a moment. He said, Karen has requested that the board allow her to address the situation directly with you. Is that the board's recommendation? I said. No, he said. The board's recommendation is to proceed with the negotiated easement process as you proposed. Karen's request is separate and the board has not endorsed it. Tell her I'll speak with her, I said, after the easement agreement is executed. The easement negotiation took 4 months. Patricia, Webb and Leonard and Renata and the HOA's board spent those months working through the terms, easement width, maintenance responsibilities, insurance requirements, the easement payment amount, the boundary documentation, and the correction of the recorded deeds for the 53 Clearwater Ranch properties. The deed correction process involved the title insurance companies, all of them, across 28 years of transactions, and produced what Patricia Webb described to me as the most complex title remediation she had handled in 22 years of practice. The title companies ultimately absorbed the cost of the remediation because the error had been in the original development survey that their predecessors had insured. The easement was executed and recorded in month 5. The Clearwater Ranch HOA paid a fair and negotiated amount for a permanent access easement, not an amount designed to extract maximum value from a position of legal leverage, but an amount that reflected the genuine value of the access and that Renata and I were satisfied with. The pending HOA complaint against the Reeves Ranch was formally withdrawn with a written acknowledgement, signed by Howard Kimball as board president, that the complaint had been filed on an incorrect factual basis and that the Reeves Ranch boundary and activities along the ridgeline were entirely within the Reeves Ranch property. Howard signed because Karen had resigned from the board presidency the week the HOA's survey results were shared with the full board. She came to our door in month 6. The easement was recorded. The boundary correction was underway. The complaint had been withdrawn. She came alone. No clipboard, no documentation, no prepared presentation. She stood on our porch and looked at me for a moment before she spoke. She said, I filed a complaint saying you were encroaching on our boundary. Yes, I said. And your survey found that our access road is on your property. Yes. I've been the HOA president for 3 years, she said. I organized the aesthetics committee. I filed 7 boundary-related complaints against the Reeves Ranch in that time. I told my community that the ranch was a persistent problem for our western boundary. Yes, I said. And the boundary runs 2,000 feet east of where I said it was. 2,340 feet, I said. In my survey, 2,328 in Gerald Morrison's independent confirmation. She absorbed this. I was wrong, she said, in a significant way, about a significant thing, and the complaint I filed while I was wrong accelerated the survey process that revealed how wrong I was. She paused. I understand there's an irony in that. There is, I said. I'm sorry for the complaints, she said. The 7 I filed, they were based on an assumption about the boundary that was incorrect. I said, did you know they were incorrect when you filed them? She was quiet for a long time. I knew I hadn't verified the boundary, she said. I knew I was assuming the ridgeline. I filed the complaints on the assumption anyway. She paused. That's different from knowing I was wrong, but it's also not the same as acting in good faith. It was the most honest thing I had heard from her. Not an excuse, not a reframing, not a justification. A specific and accurate description of the gap between what she had known and what she had verified and what she had done in that gap. I appreciate the honesty, I said. Renata appeared in the doorway. She looked at Karen. Karen looked at Renata. Karen said, I'm sorry for the complaints, and I'm sorry for the complaint I filed just before you found the survey pins. That one is particularly, she stopped. That one I'm particularly sorry for. Renata said, the easement is recorded, the boundary is corrected, 53 families have clear title to their homes and legal access to the county road. She paused. That's the outcome that mattered. Karen said, yes. She left. I stood at the front door for a moment after she turned down the driveway. The ridgeline was visible from where I stood, the feature that 4 generations of my family had understood as the eastern boundary of the Reeves Ranch, the feature that 30 years of development and 53 homes and a community of families had been organized around, the feature that had turned out not to be where any of the legal records said the boundary was. The survey pins were where they had always been. The ridgeline was where it had always been. The gap between them was where 30 years of assumption had lived, undisturbed, until I went looking. Renata came to stand beside me. She said, how does it feel? I thought about what it felt like. About 6 months of complexity and careful negotiation and the specific weight of holding a legal position with significant leverage and choosing not to use it as a weapon. About 53 families who had gone to bed one evening in October not knowing that the only road connecting them to the outside world was on property that wasn't theirs, and who had gone to bed 6 months later with a recorded easement and clear title, and the same access they had always had. About the survey pin that had always been in the same place, telling the same truth, waiting for someone to look. Correct, I said. It feels correct. Renata leaned against my shoulder. The ridgeline caught the afternoon light, the way ridgelines catch light in Colorado, specific and clear, every edge of it visible. It was not the boundary, it had never been the boundary. But it was still the ridgeline. And the ranch was still ours. All 412 acres of it, documented and bounded and mine, the way it had been since Elias Reeves had stood somewhere on this land in 1887, and understood that the earth beneath his feet was his, and that the government monuments said so, and that the monuments did not lie. The monuments still did not lie. They never had. Framed thumbnail text. The survey pin was always there. Nobody checked for 30 years.